Anyway, the talk I'm going to give tonight is billed as a seasonal story. Great to see so many, well, lovely to see so many people I know. It's always nice to see new people, but there's loads of people I know, and you've all heard it before. So that's a tradition. Once, back in the depths of time, I made the mistake of telling the story of Scrooge before, just before Christmas at Sangha night. And then I was asked to do it again the next year, and I said, well, surely not. And then I was asked to do it every Xmas afterwards, again and again and again, against all my protestations, that enough is enough. So for more years than I can remember, I've tried to relate the Dickens story at Christmas, Christmas Carol, to the theme we're looking at. So we've had Scrooge and the wisdom of the depths. We've had Scrooge and the 4 reflections that turn the mind. We've had Scrooge and the 5 aspects of the spiritual life. And we've even had Tantric Spirit Scrooge. Tonight, despite my protestations as traditional, my challenge is to talk about Scrooge and the 7-fold puja. So one thing about so Dickens' Christmas Carol and the puja have in common that both describe a process of spiritual transformation. Both start with us as we are now, or Scrooge as he is at the beginning, and both end with the eruption of something very positive. I mean, in the puja, the eruption of the bodhicitta, the eruption of the positive forces in the universe. And something similar with Scrooge. But there is one big difference between the Christmas Carol and the 7-fold puja. In the puja, we voluntarily, willingly imagine ourselves passing through the stages of the spiritual transformation. In our imagination, as a sort of rehearsal. So we do this with the aim of paving the way for that transformation in our real life, in our everyday life. It's as though we're gradually digging a channel by doing the puja. We're gradually digging a channel from where we are now to where we want to get to, the arising of the bodhicitta. So that it gradually becomes easier and easier for the waters of our being to flow in that direction. I am going to be using a lot of watery hydraulic analogies tonight. But the transformation that happens to Scrooge is not entered into voluntarily. It's a real transformation that happens to his body and soul, all of his being, but it's not entered into voluntarily. He resists it, as we'll see. So Scrooge has dammed himself up. He's created a wall between himself and other people, and he's created a wall between himself and his own emotions. So he's dammed in by walls of his own creation so that the waters of his being cannot move. He is like a stagnant pool. And we can all do this, actually, when we try to stay the same, to resist the uncomfortable process of growth and change. We dam ourselves in because we prefer our smelly, stagnant pool to the challenges of whitewater rafting that might happen if our dam breaks. And when we do this, when we dam ourselves up like this, if we are lucky, the world or the forces of growth in our own depths can break through the dams we've created to protect ourselves so that growth and change can happen. And this is what happens to Scrooge in the Christmas Carol. Okay, so let's start off by just looking at the character of Scrooge before the transformation happens at the beginning of the story. So, of course, what he's really famous for is being mean and stingy with money. And, well, he's certainly that. But there is more to it than that. That is a symptom, I think, rather than the disease. The main analogy Dickens uses to describe Scrooge is cold. So he says, the cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, and made his thin lips blue. He carried his own low temperature always with him. He iced his office in the summer, and he didn't thaw it 1 degree in winter. So this cold that Dickens uses as an analogy, it's a symbol to tell us that he is completely cut off from all the emotions that could warm his heart, because he has cut himself off from all emotion. And as I said, he's also walled himself off from other people. So Dickens says, nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, my dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come and see me? But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To warn all human sympathy to keep its distance was what he wanted. So those are the dams that Scrooge has built around himself, which makes him a stagnant pool and stops him growing. He's cut himself off from his emotions to avoid pain, and he's chosen to cut himself off from other people to protect himself and maintain his sense of superiority. And obviously this is creating a very unhappy life for Scrooge. In his unhappiness, the one thing he's left caring about is money, really. He is going for refuge to money. That's the one refuge he's left, money. So Scrooge has walled himself off, dammed himself up, but he is lucky enough that some force for growth within him doesn't accept that and contrives to break through the dam. And this comes, first of all, in the shape of his old business partner, Jacob Marley. So we probably all know the story. Although it's Christmas Eve, it should be the season of goodwill, Scrooge is thoroughly nasty to his nephew, who invites him around for Christmas dinner. He's thoroughly nasty to his poor, underpaid and overworked clerk, Bob Cratchit. He's thoroughly nasty to the charity collectors who come round collecting money for the poor. He says to them, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And if some do die, that will reduce the surplus population. So he's all this sort of cold, alienated intellect, no positive emotion, no connection to others. And then as a cold and frosty and foggy night falls, he makes his way home from his office through the gathering gloom. It's just about dark as he gets home. And in the gloom, something erupts into his narrow conscious mind. He's visited by a guest he does not want to receive. So in the first stage of the sevenfold puja, we imagine ourselves inviting an honored guest. We invite the transformative processes, forces of growth and positive emotion and wisdom and reality. We invite them into our awareness. We talk about inviting the enlightened mind, the first line of the puja we often use, in order to invite the enlightened mind. And then in the puja that's more often used in Triratna and in Shantideva's chapters describing the puja, we imagine ourselves offering the 7 traditional Indian offerings to an honored guest. Things like food, hard and soft. I always imagine dal and rice for some reason. Water for drinking, water for washing, perfume, light, etc., etc. All the things we might give, or you might give in India, to make an honored guest comfortable, to attract an honored guest to your premises. And these 7 offerings are symbolized by the 7 offering bowls we always have on a shrine. So in a sense, whenever we set before a shrine, we're always inviting the honored guest of the positive forces in the universe into our awareness. And these positive forces that we invite in the first stage of the puja, They do pay a visit to Scrooge, but he does not want them. He does not want to receive them. He tries very hard to resist what should be the honoured guest. And the honoured guest is unwelcome because it might disturb the narrow, limited way of life that he finds safe and comfortable. So this honoured guest takes an unpleasant form. In the gloom, he reaches for the great big door knocker on the great big door of his great big house. But instead of the usual doorknob, he sees the head of his old business partner, Jacob Marley, who has been dead these past 6 years. So he recoils in shock and horror. But then he reminds himself he's down-to-earth rationalist. He says, "Bah, humbug," of course, one of several times. He collects himself and he opens the door. And then he double locks the door, thinking that will keep out whatever he's troubling him, like a good materialist. But then when he gets into the hallway of his big, empty, dark, gloomy house, he thinks he sees a hearse with a coffin on it going up the great big staircase. And then when he gets into his gloomy living room where he's just got a little fire and one candle because he's so mean, he sees his ornate fireplace, which is carved with all sorts of figures. He thinks that each figure has the head of his dead partner, Jacob Marley. And then the sort of bells, the old houses have bells that you pull to get a servant. They're all over his house. And they start to ring of their own accord. They start to rock and ring of his own accord. And he hears the clanking of chains as though someone is dragging them across the floor. And then the ghost of his old business partner, Jacob Marley, appears to him, looking all miserable and totally wrapped about in chains. And he gives Scrooge a message he does not want to hear. So he tells Scrooge the reason that he, Jacob Marley, is wrapped up in chains is because of his self-centered life, in which he didn't care about anyone but himself. He says the chains are of his own making. He says, "I made them link by link by the mean and selfish way I lived my life. And now I have to drag them around." He says, "I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it." So he tells Scrooge about the law of karma, which can be quite terrifying. And then he goes on, "Would you like to know the weight and the length of the chain you bear yourself? It was just as heavy as this 7 years ago. But you've worked on it since. It is a ponderous, heavy chain." So he says that Scrooge has spent a long time making just the same sort of chains that he wears. And unless he changes his life, he will face the same sort of horrible fate, doomed to wander around as an unhappy spirit, dragging the chains that he's created by his actions, forever doomed to regret for wasting the precious opportunity of human life. So Jacob Marley's ghost gives Scrooge a strong Dharma teaching, for which Scrooge should be grateful. He's doing it for Scrooge's benefit. Jacob Marley should be the honoured guest, but because Scrooge doesn't want to receive him, he comes in this dreadful form. So the ghost changes him. It tells him he must change, and that he will see 3 more spirits as the night goes on, which might bring that transformation about. So that takes us in a way through the first stage of the puja, receiving a guest from the realm of reality who should be honoured. We try to honour them, but for Scrooge it's unwelcome. So he says, "Bah humbug," or he tries to say bah humbug. But sure enough, in the course of the night, 3 different guests do appear to Scrooge. as he tries to get some sleep in his big, dark, gloomy house. So the first one appears at 1 in the morning, and it's the ghost of Christmas past. And this ghost wants to show Scrooge some things from his past. But Scrooge really doesn't want to know. He resists. He is anything but receptive. The ghost apparently is very, very small, and light shines from it. And Scrooge, rather comically, keeps trying to snuff it out with a candle snuffer, which is rather a comical image. It never works. But in the end, despite Scrooge's protestations and resistance, the ghost takes him on a journey against his will. He opens the window, flies out the window, taking Scrooge, and he carries him out into the night, away from London, over the surrounding countryside, until Scrooge gets to a landscape that he remembers from his childhood. And what the ghost shows Scrooge are two things that I think are related. So the things he sees, the things Scrooge sees when he looks at his past, they begin to break through the dam he has built to protect himself from his emotions, both positive and joyful, both painful and joyful. And they also lead him towards seeing the reasons for the person he is now. So that he can accept that, well, he's in a bad place. He can accept that he's in a bad place because of his past, but that he needs to change. So he can forgive himself. So if we can't forgive ourselves for being the conditioned being we are now, the person that our conditions have created, then we won't be able to face it. If we will deny it. What we will do is we'll deny it. It'll stay unconscious to us. We won't want to know it because to be aware of it is too painful. So we can't acknowledge it, let it go, confess it. So what the ghost shows Scrooge brings about, if you like, the puja stage of confession. He can see and acknowledge the things he needs to change because he can relate to those parts of himself with compassion. He can see the reasons they arose. So first of all, he's shown himself as a miserable young boy, poor and lonely and neglected. He's sitting reading by himself, left by his parents in a gloomy, depressing school when all the other kids have gone home on holiday. So he obviously had a sad, friendless, lonely childhood. At some level, he's still that child. He's a sad and lonely person. But the last thing he wants is to be aware of that, to own up to that. Sadness and loneliness are not emotions that he's allowing himself to feel. They would destroy his image of himself. So until now, he's thrust them down. He's refused to own up to them. He's refused to be aware of them. The ghost had to drag him unwillingly to see his own sadness, if you like. When we refuse to be aware of emotions like those, they don't go away. They just rule us from the shadows. And these things he won't own up to are ruling Scrooge from the shadows. When we try not to be aware of painful emotions like sadness, that freezes our whole emotional life. We don't feel any emotion, including the positives. So to keep his sadness away, Scrooge froze all emotion. So no positive emotion can get a look in. And he saw his isolation from others as something positive, something that made him superior. But the ghost, in a way, dragged him to an awareness of the hidden sadness and loneliness that's driving him. So having become aware of it, he could acknowledge it. It's something that he could acknowledge and see that it's something that's holding him back from a happy, full life. In a way, he could confess it. He could see that he needed to change. He could acknowledge it. And what the ghost shows him causes all sorts of uprush of positive emotion, painful and joyful. allowing the painful emotions allows him to feel the positive emotions as well. So his compassion for his younger self turns into compassion for other children like the child he was. And he gets an uprush of regret from having turned away a child just like himself who came to the door begging for food. He's also shown his sister, who he loved but who died as a young adult, and re-experiences sadness at her death, his fond feelings for her, the love that he'd frozen out. And he experiences regret about an old romance and the life that he could have had if he'd just been more open to others. And he has shown himself in his first job with his close friend Dick and his kind, if rather humorous employer, Dr. Fezziwig. I love Dickens's names here. So he remembers a party that Mr. Fezziwig and his missus put on for the family and friends and staff, Christmas party. He remembers how it made him feel. For once, Scrooge is really happy and dancing, and he feels a strong uprush of gratitude to Mr. Fezziwig. And all this positive emotion that he's feeling to children and Mr. Fezziwig and all sorts of others allows him to move on to the next puja stage of rejoicing in merit, the very opposite of his usual approach to other people. So he sees himself and his friend Dick, as Dickin puts it, pouring their hearts out in praise of Mr. Fezziwig. He sees himself rejoicing in merits. And as an old adult, he sort of joins in with that rejoicing in merits, because the ghost tries to mock him with the sort of things he would have said himself in the past to sort of avoid rejoicing. But Scrooge defends his younger self because he is sharing in the rejoicing. So by now, Jacob Marley has appeared as the guest, the first stage, who should have been honoured. And the Ghost of Christmas Past has taken Scrooge through, I think, the phases of confession, acknowledging what needs to change, and rejoicing in merits. Well, what happened to the second and third stages, you might ask yourself? What happened to salutation and going for refuge? We'll get to those later. But now we move on to the sixth stage. Having rejoiced in merit, well, until now, Scrooge has been anything but receptive. He didn't want to receive the honoured guest in Jacob Marley, and he didn't want to see what the Ghost of Christmas Past had to show him. He didn't want to acknowledge that he needed to change, and he didn't want to experience his his painful emotions. He had to be dragged towards seeing that there were things that needed to change, and he had to be dragged towards rejoicing in merits. But when the next ghost appears, the Ghost of Christmas Present, Scrooge has moved on to the next stage of the puja, entreaty and supplication. So in this stage, the sixth stage, we ask to be taught. We express our receptivity, and we make a request for a teaching. And Scrooge says submissively to the Ghost of Christmas Present, "Take me where you will. Last night I was compelled to go forth. Tonight, if you have anything to teach me, let me profit by it." So that's quite interesting, because he says, last night I was compelled to go forth, but tonight, if you have anything to teach me, let me profit by it. This is supposed to all be happening in one night. But those are Dickens' words. I think his editor should have spotted this. Seems to be happening over several days at this point. But anyway, that's beside the point. Until now, I was forced to see things against my will, but now I want to learn. Please give me a teaching and let me profit by it. That's what Scrooge is saying. And the ghost does just that. He gives Scrooge a teaching, or some teachings. So in the puja, after the entreaty section, We hear a teaching from the Buddhist canon, and then we chant the Heart Sutra, the sutra that is said to express the heart of perfect wisdom. And the ghost gives Scrooge some wisdom teachings, but some wisdom teachings that are a bit difficult to digest, a bit difficult to swallow. First of all, he shows Scrooge that his actions have some very real heavy consequences. So he shows the family of Bob Cratchit, his very put upon clerk, getting ready for their Christmas dinner. So Scrooge is a terrible employer to Cratchit. He pays him hardly anything. He freezes him to death in his office because he's too mean to supply enough coal. He overworks him, and he even complains about having to give him Christmas Day off. And if Cratchit asks for anything, Scrooge just threatens to dismiss him. So the Cratchit family are very poor with an employer like Scrooge. They're shabbily dressed and they're badly fed. And among them is a child called Tiny Tim, who walks with a tiny crutch and has his limbs supported by an iron frame. I used to see lots of kids like that when I was younger, when I was very young, kids who'd had polio, who'd had to have their limbs supported by an iron frame. Presumably that's Tiny Tim. And Scrooge's newly warmed heart goes out to Tiny Tim when he sees him. And he asks the ghost, tell me if Tiny Tim will live. Please tell me if Tiny Tim will live. And the ghost replies, I see a vacant seat in the chimney breast and a crutch without an owner lovingly preserved. If things remained unchanged, the child will die. And of course, the main thing, or one of the things that has to change, is Scrooge and his attitude towards his clerk, his meanness towards his clerk. So Scrooge sees that his actions will lead to the death of Tiny Tim unless he changes his ways. So it's a pretty strong teaching that our actions have very, very serious consequences. So moving on from that, the ghost shows him the Cratchits and all sorts of other people having a wonderful, happy time, shaking hands in all sorts of different situations, like miners who have a very rough life, like even two lighthouse keepers in their lighthouse, feeling goodwill towards each other, expressing their goodwill towards each other, even in very, very difficult circumstances, creating a happiness that he cannot share. And hardest of all to take, hardest bit of wisdom of all, is that he sees what other people think of him. So Bob Cratchit's wife is quite bitter about him. She expresses herself quite strongly on the subject of Scrooge, and Bob Cratchit sort of tries to mitigate that. So, but yeah, she really doesn't like Scrooge. And then he sees his nephew, and his nephew actually says that he feels sorry for him. He says, I feel sorry for him. Who suffers by his ill will? Only himself. And then hardest of all, perhaps, he sees that people think he's funny. At his nephew's Christmas party, there's one of these wonderful Christmas role-playing games going on where people are pretending to be things and then having to guess them. And somebody is mocking Scrooge, pretending to be Scrooge, role-playing Scrooge, and asking others, what animal am I playing? And in the end, they guess Scrooge. And the nephew comes right out and says, he is a comical old fellow. So this is a pretty bitter dose of wisdom for Scrooge, who thinks his wealth and his no-nonsense attitude towards everything makes him superior to others, places him above these fools out there. So some pretty heavy wisdom teachings, and things don't get any better when the third ghost appears, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. This ghost shows him his own death. And it shows him the legacy he leaves behind. So he sees the important businessmen who he thinks are his peers, who he wants to respect him. He sees what they really think of him. One of them says, it will be a very cheap funeral because nobody will go. And another one jokes that maybe he will go for the free lunch. He sees that he has no friends or admirers or anyone who respects him in all the world. There is nobody who regrets his death. He sees other people taking the money and possessions he's treasured so much that he goes for refuge to, and there is nothing he can do about it. He sees himself dying alone, lonely and miserable, and he thinks, avarice, hard dealing, griping cares, they have brought me to a rich end truly. So he asks the spirit, the ghost of Christmas yet to be, if there is anyone who feels any regret at his death. And instead, the spirit shows him a couple who owe him money and are going to be thrown out of their house because they can't pay him. And he hears them say how glad they are that Scrooge is dead, because whoever takes over the debt cannot possibly be as hard-hearted as Scrooge. And then he is shown the future after his death. Someone else is in his chair, someone else is in his office, everything carries on as it was. He might as well never have existed. The only sign of his life is an overgrown gravestone that nobody can be bothered to look after. So he sees the fact that we are all impermanent, that things will carry on as though we never existed, unless we leave some positive legacy behind by our actions, by our positive actions. Well, that's not an easy teaching. But coming on the back of what has gone before, it's the last straw. It's the last straw that breaks through all the dams that Scrooge has constructed that have kept him stuck and stagnant. And it's the last straw that allows a complete transformation in Scrooge. He says to the host, he says to the ghost, not the host, misspelling on my thing. He says to the ghost, I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I would have been but for these teachings. So I think that represents the stage of going for refuge. He's going for refuge here. He's saying, I'm going to change. I'm not going to do that anymore. It's late in the day. It's late, but the puja doesn't always follow that necessary progression. Even in Shantideva has to be said. So it's the going for refuge. He's going for refuge. I will not be that man. I will change. I will not be the man I would have been but for these teachings. And then he wakes up and he realizes that he's in his own bed in his gloomy house. And now he does honor the unwelcome guest that was Jacob Marley. And rather late in the day, he passes through the second stage of the puja. Salutation or bowing. Can be translated as bowing or even prostrating. So he says, "Oh, Jacob Marley, be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Marley, on my knees." And that, of course, is what we do in our imagination after the first stage and during the second stage. We honor our guest, we bow, or even do it on our knees. Be praised for this. I say it on my knees, oh Marley, be praised. So he's now showing the respect for the honored guest that might have come earlier had he not been so resistant. He's showing gratitude for the teaching that this has brought about in him. So Scrooge has now passed through all the stages of the puja. And he's arrived at the last stage, the culmination. So in the last stage of the sevenfold puja, we imagine letting go of our old self and giving ourselves to the bodhicitta, to the forces of good in the universe, giving ourselves as a resource to all beings, letting go of the old self-centered self, giving ourselves as a resource. And something similar happens to Scrooge. So he sends a boy off to buy a turkey, and he sends it round to Bob Cratchit's house by taxi. He gives a big, he also gives Bob Cratchit a big rise in salary. And he gives a large sum of money to the charity collectors that he previously refused, indeed mocked, actually. We're told, Dickens's word, he became as good a friend, as good an employer, and as good a man as London had ever known. Some people laughed to see the transformation in him, but he didn't pay any attention. And all of this, of course, was accompanied by an uprush of joy. He says, I'm light as a feather, I'm happy as an angel, I'm as merry as a schoolboy. And then both the puja and the Christmas carol end with a feast. In the puja, we say, for the whole procession of humanity, traveling the roads of existence, this will bring them joy. I invite the world to be my guest at a great feast of delight. May all beings rejoice. And Scrooge goes round to his nephew's house for Christmas dinner and has a great feast of delight. Has a great old time and expresses the wish, a Merry Christmas to everybody, a Happy New Year to all the world. And that's the end of the story. And Tiny Tim does not die.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Vadanya. You did it. I never